Hello, everyone. My name is Thomas Hanna, and I'm the Research Director at the Democracy Collaborative based in the United States. Before I get started, I first wanted to say how much of a great honor it is to be here today, even if it is just by video. For the past several years, I've devoted much of my professional and personal life to advancing, promoting, and defending publicly owned enterprises, services, and assets. So it's incredibly humbling and exciting to be working with the workers and the unions that make those services possible on a day-to-day basis. Today, I'd first like to introduce myself and my organization a little bit further, and then talk very briefly about the new research project on public services and community wealth building that we have just started with PSI. After that, there should be some time for questions, comments, or suggestions, which I believe Daria will collect and pass along to me, and which will be really helpful in designing and implementing this project. So the Democracy Collaborative is a US-based R&D lab focused on helping to build a more democratic, equitable, and sustainable economic system, which basically means we work at both the level of theory and practice. Regarding the former, we do a lot of research and writing about the benefits, challenges, and opportunities of alternative models of ownership. And by this, we mean collective and democratic alternatives to the dominant model of ownership that currently exists in many economies around the world today, the large for-profit corporation and private ownership more generally. While these alternatives include models like cooperatives, community corporations, nonprofit social enterprises, community land trusts, and so on, it also includes and really kind of prioritizes various forms of public ownership. And this is where I focused much of my efforts over the past several years, including a book I wrote in 2018 about the surprising prevalence and durability of public services, enterprises, and assets in the United States, especially at the municipal level. We also do a lot of work on the ground in communities to rethink and redevelop their local economies around these alternative ownership models. So that brings me to our new research project, which has a provisional title of Public Services and Community Wealth Building, Leveraging the Power and Potential of Public Services to Create Stable and Prosperous Local Economies. Public services are intrinsically related to the health of local economies through positive and negative feedback loops. When local communities are suffering economically, public services are often cut or degraded as part of misguided austerity measures. This only further damages local economies, which, in turn, can lead to more public service cuts. On the other hand, when local communities are thriving, more resources are available to be invested in public services. This then further strengthens the local economy and can, in turn, lead to more investment in public services. As such, public services and public sector unions have an opportunity and something of a responsibility to begin to think more holistically and creatively about the role that they do and can play in local economies and community economic development. Specifically, while public services around the world already play a major role in local economic development in both direct and indirect ways, they could much more intentionally link their activities to an emerging paradigm in economic development called community wealth building. So what is community wealth building? Community wealth building is a growing movement that seeks to transform the ethos and practice of economic development such that it works to produce broadly shared economic prosperity, racial and economic equity, and ecological sustainability through the reconfiguration of institutions and local economies on the basis of greater democratic ownership, participation, and control. While this definition is definitely somewhat complex and convoluted, community wealth building is actually quite simple. It directly contrasts with and has emerged in response to the dominant form of economic development that emerged during the neoliberal period, which focuses on private sector approaches, such as public subsidies for corporate attraction and retention, privatization and corporatization of public services and assets, and the enclosure and commercialization of human experiences and interactions. Central to the community wealth building paradigm is the concept of community self-determination. In other words, community wealth building is not a top-down prescriptive model that will look the same everywhere that it's implemented. Rather, it's a suite of tactical interventions that can help a community navigate their own path based on their own local, political, economic, social, or cultural context. Publicly owned assets, enterprises, and services are critical to community wealth building in two ways. First, as collectively owned not-for-profit organizations, they are central to the goal of building a more equitable and democratic local economy. As such, growing, stabilizing, and sustaining public service is a key community wealth building goal and approach. This includes the insourcing of jobs and contracts that had previously been outsourced to the private sector. It also includes municipalizing or nationalizing important goods, services, and assets that have either been privatized or otherwise should be in public hands. Things like electric and water utilities, land and housing, banks and financial assets, telecommunications and internet services, and so on and so forth. Secondly, as large economic institutions that are rooted in place, public services are what we call anchor institutions that can, if they so choose, play a pretty important role in incentivizing and supporting further democratic and developmental changes in the wider commercial economy, which, as I just mentioned, can lead to healthier and more prosperous local economies, which in turn can help generate more resources to support public services. We call this approach adopting the anchor mission, which means a commitment to consciously apply the place-based economic power of the institution in combination with its human and intellectual resources to better the long-term welfare of the community in which the institution is based. In general, there are three broad categories of activities an anchor institution, such as a public service or enterprise, can take to support community wealth building in the wider local economy. The first is workforce development. As I mentioned earlier, strengthening, The first is workforce development. As I mentioned earlier, strengthening and expanding public service employment through both insourcing and growth is a key feature of community wealth building. This should include developing robust hiring and training pipelines for local residents to gain employment in the public service, especially those residents from historically marginalized backgrounds and those who are struggling to find employment in the commercial sector for various reasons. One example of this from the US is the Chicago Transit Authority's highly successful Second Chance program, which provides training, education, and jobs to returning citizens, abuse victims, and other residents who are experiencing barriers to employment. It could also include more creative strategies, such as providing affordable housing for public service workers and their families, and developing ways for public service workers and their unions to more actively participate in the planning, governance, and operations of the service or enterprise. The second set of strategies revolve around investment and asset management. Anchor institutions such as public services often have significant financial and real assets that could possibly be deployed in ways that build community wealth rather than fuel extraction. This includes revenue from operations that could be deposited in local public banks, credit unions, or community development financial institutions to boost local lending and investment, and also rethinking the governance, management, investing strategy of public service pension funds. Examples of the latter from the US include the California Public Pension Program, CalPERS, which has a local investment requirement of around 10%, and also the American Federation of Teachers, which a few years ago decided to invest around $10 billion from its public pension fund into local infrastructure, including new school construction. It could also include strategies such as renting, leasing, or donating certain parcels of land or facilities that are currently unneeded or underused by the public service to other municipal agencies and or nonprofit groups for housing, community space, or other publicly benefiting services. Lastly, the third set of strategies relate to public procurement and spending. As I previously mentioned, insourcing is a key feature of community wealth building and should be a primary strategy and focus for public services. However, in most cases, not all activities or goods a public service needs can be done in-house. In such cases, the contracts for these goods and services should be redirected away from large for-profit companies and towards other public services in the form of public-public partnerships, local democratically owned businesses such as worker cooperatives or nonprofit social enterprises, and in some cases to small local for-profit companies with a priority given to those owned by women and people from historically marginalized groups. In the past few years, I think there's been some confusion around this last set of strategies as it relates to public services. Specifically, a few unions may have interpreted the public spending and procurement aspect of community wealth building to mean that public services or public sector jobs might be divested or outsourced to voluntary organizations such as cooperatives. And this, I think, has resulted in a little bit of wariness towards the concept. I hope that my remarks here today have already alleviated such fears, but I will just add that I've been around basically since the beginning of when this term community wealth building was created in the mid-2000s. And to my knowledge, and also to the knowledge of my colleagues who I've talked to around this, to date, not a single community wealth building project around the world has explicitly supported or endorsed the outsourcing of public sector jobs or services to the voluntary sector. And actually, by contrast, some of the more developed community wealth building projects actually have a really good track record of insourcing and or democratizing services that had previously been contracted to large private corporations. So just to wrap up, we plan to divide this research project up into three parts. Part one, we'll look at the current direct and indirect role public services play in local economic development. Then part two, we'll take a more detailed look at community wealth building and what it is not, and how it particularly relates to public services, public procurement, and public sector unions. And then lastly, in part 3, we'll make some initial recommendations for how public services can begin to integrate community wealth building ideas and approaches into their operations and connect with and support wider community wealth building efforts in local communities. As I mentioned from the beginning, if anyone is interested in this project and these ideas more generally, or if you have interesting examples or case studies from anywhere in the world that you think we should look at, I'd really love to hear from you either in the Q&A session or directly in the coming weeks and months. So thank you all again for the opportunity to speak with you today, and please enjoy the rest of your meetings.